Well, welcome. And just want to say that I'm thrilled to see that there's so many people who are watching this on Facebook. And as I said yesterday, I believe, I hope it isn't Facebook playing tricks on me. And that actually you not just clicking on it, but that you're actually finding the content of these sessions to be interesting. That is the idea, that it should be an enjoyable pastime, if not a deeper experience. So, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Amen.
Well, a couple of days ago, or maybe it was even yesterday, that I referenced a Torah T'mimah regarding, the fact that the way Moses set out his pleas before God in this week's Parsha, that's an example for all of us as to how to set out our prayers. And in this Torah, that's where the Torah T'mimah took this, that we should start off when we are engaging God and supplicating God, that we should start off with first acknowledging God's greatness and all the things that the blessings that we've received already. And then we should go into whatever it is that we need. And in fact, we should also end with a statement of appreciation. And he referenced a Maimonides, which is a reference to one of Maimonides' major works, his Mishneh Torah. It's also known as the Yad HaChazakah, because there are 14 major sections, and Yud Daled is the number 14 in the Hebrew alphabet. And so it's known as Yad HaChazakah, which means the strong hand. And essentially, Maimonides takes his encyclopedic knowledge of Judaism, of rabbinic literature, and all the stuff, and of halakha, and sets it out, organizes it, sets it out in beautiful classic Hebrew, and essentially explains how to practice Judaism. That's at least traditional Judaism. And so it occurred to me that since this work is in fact still in existence, to perhaps look at the reference point and share this with you and see if you might actually find this interesting as well as instructive. So give me one moment as I open the window on what we're looking at. Okay. So I'm going to see if I can get the page to show up. And here we are. This actually comes from a beautiful edition. I actually own, this is from a website that has many Jewish classic works that are simply there now in PDF form. But I actually have, was part of my dad's library, this beautiful, very large folio set of the Rambam. I have to tell you that if I were to actually read the books that I own in my library, I would live many lifetimes. It is so intense. So this is, we took a quick look at this yesterday, Hilchot Tefillah, the laws of prayer and the priestly benediction. We actually read all of this, and it's from a section called Ahava, one of these major sections of the 14 sections, which is Ahava means love, right? And Hilchot Tefillah, Perek Rishon, laws of prayer, the first chapter. This is a commentary. I discussed yesterday also what is challenging about reading the Rambam. He doesn't tell you his sources. And one of these commentators, I believe, maybe I didn't have a chance to quickly look it up. I had planned to. I'm not sure if the Kesef Mishneh is actually written by, I think Asher ben Yechiel, but I could be wrong. I need to it's a straight look up and a checkup in Google to see who wrote Kesef Mishneh, this major commentary where he tries to give the sources of these halachot and also explain possible difficulties. So with that in mind, we'll plunge into the Maimonides itself. The actual reference was to this chapter and to section 2, and you'll possibly see how that works out. Why is that? At any rate, mitzvat aseh, it is a positive commandment, lehit palel b'chol yom, to pray every day. Shene'emar, as it states, va'avadatem et Hashem Elokeichem. I looked up the reference, right? The reference isn't in here. This particular edition of the Rambam doesn't provide scriptural references, so one has to look them up. This is from Exodus 23:25, and it says, "You shall serve the Lord your God." And this already, of course, is something for us moderns, I should say, and liberal Jews, to consider what's the implication of that, right? What does it mean to serve the Lord your God? And do we even accept that as a primary function of our lives? And to understand just how significant, we talk about mitzvot, and this is a little bit of a soapbox, unfortunately, of mine, that we talk about mitzvot as good deeds, and in that sense, we devalue them, right? When you consider them as commandments coming from a divine sovereign, and that divine sovereign is commanding us to do this, and that's what our religion is trying to put inside of us. It puts a whole different complexion as to the urgency with which we need to look at these things seriously and study them and try to curb our lives in such a way that they reflect that. So, thank you. Okay. Oh, okay. Thanks, Lauren. So it's actually, all right, very good. So it's Rabbi Joseph Caro, who's also author of the Shulchan Aruch, right? So thank you. My memory, at one point I knew that, and I'm glad you checked it out and corrected me. Thank you. So Joseph Caro, that, by the way, that just tells you the level of knowledge and brilliance of Joseph Caro. So anyway, thank you. That's where he comes. We'll keep going with this, right? And he says, "Mipi hashmu'ah." This means that through tradition, lamdu, we learn, or they learned, right? She'avodah zo, that this particular service that we're talking about, right? When it says you shall serve the Lord your God, and that it refers to prayer, zohi tfilah, okay? Tfilah, we learn through tradition that this kind of service refers to tfilah, to prayer. Shene'emar, how do we know this? Because it says, La'avdo b'chol levavchem, to serve him with all your hearts, right? And that is Deuteronomy 11:13. Amru chachamim, and our sages said, Ezo hi avodah shebalev. What do we mean about service? What is meant by service in the heart? What is heart service, right? As opposed to performing other kinds of mitzvot. Zo tfilah, that refers to prayer. So that when we pray, that is serving God with our hearts. So that prayer involves our emotions, right? And our intellect and our thoughts with respect to God. And I think the interesting point, or one interesting point of this, is seeing prayer as something having such significance as being an act of service, of a commandment. Ve'ein minyan hatfilot min haTorah. And what he means by this isn't so clear, all right? And I tried to understand, and when minyan usually, of course, we know means counting. So I don't know if he's referring to the tefillot that are found like in the prayer book and in the Amidah. He is not, I think what he is trying to tell us here, and I believe it'll be clarified as we go through this, is that he's saying, because we have this concept, right, of mitzvot, of the Torah, of mitzvahs, commandments that are actually found in the Torah, and I've discussed this a little bit too, that some are explicitly stated in the Torah, some are inferred through logical deductions, and those are all considered, they're called in Aramaic, they're referred to in Aramaic as deoraita. So there are commandments that come directly from the Torah. They have the status, right, and the importance and the significance of Torah mitzvahs. And we also have another concept called Darabanan, which refers to mitzvahs, commandments, and practices that were derived by our sages. And very often, many of those have to do with protective rulings. In other words, consider for a moment, if you take one step back, how important and how much we are obsessing on this particular concept, right? So we make a distinction. Okay, all right. So at any rate, let's go on with this. So, and he says, Ve'ein Mishneh Torah, okay, and I think again, when he says Ve'ein Mishnah or Mishnah Torah Hazot, he's talking about the formulation of this particular prayer that he's referring to when he's talking about this mitzvah to pray, min haTorah. It is not a mitzvah that comes from the Torah. And so I think what he's talking about here is exactly what we find in the prayer book. In other words, what he's going to have to tell us what exactly the mitzvah is from the Torah. And right now he's telling us what it isn't. Okay, at least this is how I'm understanding Maimonides, right?
It's possible that he means Mishneh could mean the repetition of the Shemona.
Yes, it occurred to me as well. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I know. Thank you. Right. But because generally when we talk about the tefillah, we're talking about the Shemona Esrei, or that silent part of our service, which is, by the way, the essence of the service, right? Ve'ein latfilah zman kavua min haTorah. So he seems to be referring for sure to what pretty much any of us would know, at least if we have some familiarity with traditional services, that's what he's referring to. He's saying this isn't, right? So he says, to translate this, and for this prayer, zman kavua, there is no set time from the Torah. So in other words, what we have to make a positive inference, what you have in the prayer book, and all the rules, because there are lots of rules that go along with that, right? What prayers exactly are included, the formulation of those prayers, their sanctity, how they're treated. He says those are all rabbinic, essentially, rabbinic practices. They are not, when he says min haTorah, I believe he means deoraita. Okay, that's what min haTorah would mean in Aramaic. Right. This is the section that was referred to. Ulefichach, and he says, for this reason, nashim va'avadim, both women and, in this case, he means slaves, Hebrew slaves, right, whose time is bound up in taking care of family or of the family priorities, right? He says that women and slaves chayavim betfilah, they are obligated to pray. In other words, the prayer that is in fact this positive commandment from the Torah is something women and slaves are in fact obligated to do. Now, please forgive me. I know that it feels insulting to associate women and slaves. It is not, please forgive me, it's not intended, as far as I'm concerned, to suggest anything other than the responsibility, at least back in those times, if in fact it still is something that needs to be considered seriously, is the ability that women have to prioritize and take care of raising the children. of making sure that the needs of the children are kept. And the men had certainly their responsibilities and their obligations to support and provide for the family. Now, this may have changed around. Modernity may have, in fact, altered some of the ways in which we look at things. I'm not here to argue that. I'm just trying to make sure, although we may be at this point, all of you may be comfortable or at least not that uncomfortable that this doesn't have to be a big subject of discussion at this point, and we can understand that this has to do with a way of looking at commandments and the obligation, and the fact that if you're obligated to do it, that's a serious consideration if you have an obligation. So it's saying that in this kind of tefillah, every Jewish person is obligated. There are no exceptions on this. Why? He says, why? Lefi, because shehi mitzvat aseh, because this particular tefillah that he's referring to, which he has told us isn't what's in the prayer book, it isn't going to shachrit, mincha, and ma'ariv. It is not that. He says this is a positive commandment, shelo hazman grama, which is not time bounded. So there is the concept of prayer that's rabbinic, where a Jew is obligated to pray shachrit within a certain time period, mincha within a certain time period, and a ma'ariv within a certain time period. And this is not what we're talking about here. Here we're simply talking about the fact, as you'll see, that every day one is supposed to take a few moments and engage in some personal, this is personal, can we say creative if you want to, but it's your own personal meditation before God, not necessarily from the prayer book. Ela chiyuv mitzvah zo, but this particular commandment, that is the obligation of this commandment, kachu, is such sheyehe adam, that a person should mitchanen, should supplicate, umitpalel, and pray bechol yom, every day, umagid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and declare the praise of the Holy One, blessed be He, v'achar kach, and following that, shoel tzorchav, and after that, request his needs, shehu tzarich lahem, which he requires, b'vakasha, with a supplication, a request, uvetachana, and with pleading in some cases, v'achar kach, and following that, noten shevach v'hodiyah Hashem, he then gives praise and acknowledgement to God, ala tova, regarding all the good, shehishpia lo, which God has given to him, has influenced his life with, has flowed out to him. Kol echad lefi kocha, every person according to their particular strength, right, their abilities. Yes, okay. I see two people have raised their hands, so take your turns, please.
So that was unwieldy. And what was unwieldy about it is the supplication was mentioned.
Yes.
And then the other type of prayer. And then later it said after supplication.
Okay.
And then it said, and it mentioned praise God in one place and then praise God in another place.
Right.
So if you could kind of
tidy
that up a little bit,
sure
that would help.
I believe I can do that. So
my question comes in with that, which is about, we've been talking about kindness as chesed.
Right.
So this is addressing tachanun is chen. So when you answer Lauren's question, address.
Okay, so I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. But let me answer Lauren's question. Okay, for the fact that this was unwieldy. I think in simple terms, it means that we should take time during the day, any time, right? Whether it's morning, afternoon, before you go to bed, whatever. But to make sure that every day we address our minds to God, to our Creator, to the sovereign of the universe, that we take our minds and we meditate by starting first of all with reflecting on how great the divine is, right? That as creator of this universe, how vast this universe is, how complex it is, how grand it is, and to start off there. In other words, in attempting to get ourselves in sync with the source of everything. Okay? That's where it starts. But we also know that we all have personal needs of various urgencies and importance, etc. And they may be very personal, they may be more universal, etc. But to do basically these three things, the first being that meditation on God, the Creator's grandeur, right? The second thing, and uniqueness. The second thing is to take the time to look at our needs and our family's needs, community, the world, etc., and to take those thoughts towards God and seek God's help in these particular various kinds of ways. And then to conclude it by thanking God for all the blessings and all the good things that God has done for us up to this point. And in fact, consider and meditate on so many of the things that we either feel entitled to or don't recognize. That when you start to deconstruct our own lives and look at what we depend on and what is so freely given to us, and to end in that way. So Lauren, before I move on to anything else, that's basically what he's saying. It's not a formal prayer. It's not the statutory prayer. And he says, this is the commandment from the Torah. Okay? Whether tachanun is a requesting of grace, I'm not sure. It may be related to the word chen, which would of course be, the connection would be seeking grace, but I'm not absolutely certain of that, or whether it comes from a different kind of root. I'd have to examine it and do some research. Is it okay to go on, or any other questions for this? But one thing I actually learned from reading this, because I had not actually, if I'd read this, and at one point I did try doing some reading of this. I mean, it's vast, right? Again, the more you know how little you know. But I actually was not aware about this particular aspect of it, that one fulfills one's biblical obligation by just taking, it could take you a minute, it could take you 5 minutes, it could take you 15 minutes, but to find some point during the day. I mean, Maimonides is very clear about it. He says, Lefi kocho, right? It has to do with, do you have the time? Do you have the intellectual capacity? Do you have the emotional capacity? Do you have the energy, etc.? I mean, it's just a matter of taking every day and finding time to reflect on your Creator. Right. Here we go. He actually has some really interesting things to say as he comments on this and introduces this whole subject of prayer. I'll try and continue, and hopefully it won't be overwhelming. Im haya ragil marbe betchina uvakasha. If he was of the habit, right? If he was used to of marbe means to have a lot of, right? To have a lot of supplication and requests. The im haya aral sfatayim. So I think what he's saying is, if he was very articulate in putting forth his supplications, or if he was literally of uncircumcised lips, right? Meaning he isn't articulate. If this person is not an articulate person, medaber kechi yecholto. So Maimonides is underlining this. He speaks according to his ability. Uvachol eit shirtzeh, and at whatever time he wants, right? So Maimonides is very clear about this. V'chein minyan ha-tefilot, and with regards to the number of prayers, kol echad kefi yecholto, every person according to their ability. Yesh mitpalel pam achat bayom, so you can have someone who prays once a day. V'yesh mitpalelim pamim harbe, and there are people who pray many times. V'hakol yiyu mitpalelim nochach hamikdash, and when you pray, you should pray in the direction of the temple, right, the sanctuary, v'chol makom sheyeh, in whatever place he is. V'chein haya hadvar tamid, okay, and this is the way things were. Moshe Rabbeinu v'ad Ezra, from the time of Moses until the time of Ezra. Give me one moment. So he's saying the essential, explaining this mitzvah that he referred to. And I think this is a good place for me to stop. And I'll stop the share. And I will tell you this much. If you want me to continue a little bit more, I can, possibly tomorrow, although I need to get back into Deuteronomy. Maimonides is translated into English. What he is going to do is, because he's talked about from Moses until Ezra, and then things changed. And he explains how things have changed and what was done to try to preserve this specific kind of tradition. So
Everything I'm seeing links Tachanun Techain.
okay, well, good. Judith, you got your answer.
Starbucks card.
Yes, definitely. Good question, Judith. Okay, so in other words, it's a seeking of God's grace, which I think is the point you were making, Judith. So thank you. Good. I'd rather try to answer that with a measure of certainty. So I'm glad Lauren did the research.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
A question I have, we have the word sane
Yes.
in our tefillot, but it's Christians I hear talking about grace.
Yes.
And I wonder the Jewish spin on that concept.
You know something? It could have to do with some foundational issues in terms of the dynamics of both religions. I would say that Judaism is very conscious of the notion, as I understand the Christian notion of grace. My understanding is it means undeserved mercy. That's essentially what it means. So we talk about a grace period. In other words, you're supposed to file your taxes by, say, the 15th. But if you don't get them filed by the 15th, even though that's when they're supposed to be done, your grace period says, well, if you file them by the 20th, you're not going to be penalized. Even though technically one should be. You're supposed to file them by the 15th.
Well,
So that's what we
Jews
mean by grace periods. So as Jews, we believe in that too.
Jews don't talk. I mean, most Jews don't talk about God or use words like praise and worship. They talk about going to services. They don't say we're going to go worship. But they don't talk. They don't have that. Most Jews seem to be fairly secular minded in the way they talk, in the way they think. And it doesn't mean that within Judaism, there's not praise and God and grace and all of these concepts that seem so Christian, but a lot of Christians are real open and talking about their faith, and Jews generally either are secular or more private, maybe.
Right. So
We have
I was
that
going to.
concept in, like in the Machzor, ki ein banu ma'asim.
Right. That's an appeal for grace. That is an appeal for grace. Lauren's point, I was going to take it in a little bit of a different direction. I think within Judaism, there's a very strong belief that we earn our immortality. We earn that immortality through the performance of the mitzvot and masim tovim and good deeds. Whereas within Christianity, it would seem that it was, Christ on the cross that basically got us forgiven for our sins, and that Christ made the ultimate sacrifice for humanity.
But I think that's also a little bit of a not completely real division, because there are elements in Judaism of looking at what God does for us as God's will and not completely earned. And I think there are elements of Christianity about having to fit into certain behaviors to have certain rewards.
There's no question. I am oversimplifying. There's no question about it. And not only that, within Catholicism, right, there have been changes throughout the centuries where there was a question of, there is a basic issue of faith versus acts within Christianity, at least traditionally, and to whether faith is what's really important as opposed to acts. And there's a whole theological discussion as to the significance of acts and whether acts have any significance at all. Within Judaism, clearly acts have tremendous significance. And my understanding is that one of the developments in the course of time, and this is centuries old at this point within Catholicism, is that Catholicism did start to sense that there was more significance in acts than certain, let's say, Protestant interpretations of Christianity. But that is not in Judaism, that is not up for grabs as to the significance of acts. I mean, the whole point of mitzvot is that it rests on acts. And it's saying whether you have milchik dishes and fleishik dishes matters. That's what Judaism, at least traditionally, is saying.
Although we do have that phrase, ein banu ma'asim,
Right.
which is very poignant kind of thing, like we try, but really what does it amount to? What we manage to do doesn't amount to much.
Yeah, I think that, but it's still not saying, it isn't saying that there is no significance to what we do. I think what it's trying to say is,
we haven't come up to the mark. We haven't measured up.
Well, I'm gonna take it a little bit differently, okay? Which is saying, given the amount of love and kindness that we get from the divine, so much of which we are so clueless about, it's a way of taking into account and saying, if you look at a scale, right, and you look at what God does for you, and you look what we do for God, this is the way things go. Okay? That we don't want to, and it's a danger that people who practice mitzvot look down on people who don't. And you want to be careful. That is a pernicious underbelly. You should not feel, I mean, that statement, ein banu ma'asim, is saying we're not in a position to say that even though we might perform mitzvot, that somehow we're better than everybody else or from people who don't. It's not for us that should not be a cause for pride. It's terrible. That's, as I said, it's a pernicious underbelly. And we need to guard against that. And that statement, ein banu ma'asim, is saying, in the grand and infinite scheme of the universe, what we manage to accomplish, even if we have devoted ourselves to learning and practicing and doing, given that in comparison to what God gives us, is relatively insignificant. But it isn't saying that making every effort to do it is insignificant. It isn't saying that. It's just saying by contrast. So look at this. I mean, we did a little bit of Maimonides. Look at the questions and the issues Maimonides raises for us in terms of definitely, our liberal modern perspective on Judaism and our understanding of it, and how hopefully doing the little bit that we did, helps and clarifies and challenges us, etc. So I'm going to stop the recording and thank you.